The winter of 1943 carried across Europe the sound of engines that had come to define the war in the air. To the men of the Luftwaffe, who had fought since the first days of Poland and France, each silhouette in the sky could be judged in an instant. They knew the Messerschmitt 109 by heart, its sharp nose and narrow wings. They trusted the heavy punch of the Focke-Wulf 190, the rugged workhorse that had bloodied the Spitfires. And when American fighters first appeared, they studied them with the practiced disdain of veterans. The P-40 had been sturdy but clumsy. The P-39 an oddity with its mid-engine design. The P-47 a brute that absorbed punishment but turned like a plow horse. So when reports surfaced of another American machine, a new type called the Mustang, the reaction was predictable. Pilots laughed in the mess halls, rolling their eyes at yet another lightweight design that would crumble before a seasoned German ace. The early Mustang gave them little reason to think otherwise. With its Allison engine, it struggled at high altitude, gasping for power where most dogfights were fought. Over North Africa, Luftwaffe veterans noticed it could move well at low level, but faltered above the clouds. Their reports to headquarters were confident. This was not a serious threat. They catalogued it as a reconnaissance plane, perhaps useful for strafing convoys, but hardly a rival to the fighters that had carried the Reich through years of battle. The intelligence files recorded the Mustang as a nuisance, not a nemesis. But beneath those dismissive lines, change was already stirring. Engineers in Britain had taken notice of the Mustang's airframe, sleek and efficient, and married it to the Merlin engine that gave the Spitfire its wings. With that transplant, the character of the aircraft shifted overnight. No longer did it falter at altitude. No longer did it struggle to keep pace. It climbed like a hawk, turned with grace, and carried its pilots farther than any German machine could dream. Yet the Luftwaffe did not realize this at once. For them, the awakening came in the sky itself, in sudden encounters where the joke of yesterday became the terror of today. The first duels with the Merlin-powered P-51 left German pilots shaken. A formation of 190s diving on American bombers found itself intercepted not by Thunderbolts lagging behind, but by Mustangs that matched every climb and punished every misstep. A Staffel commander who had boasted of 50 victories returned pale, holes stitched through his fuselage, admitting that the new enemy did not tire, did not break, did not let go. Another ace scribbled in his diary that the Mustang could stay with us at every altitude, every turn, as though the laws of flight had been rewritten. The disbelief spread quickly. Men who had once smirked at the thought of the Mustang now warned rookies in their units. Do not underestimate this machine. The comparisons cut deep. Against the Bf 109, once the master of Europe, the Mustang showed its advantage in endurance. The Messerschmitt could fight brilliantly in a short duel, but its range was a leash, keeping it close to its bases. The Mustang stretched that leash until it snapped, roaming where it pleased. Against the FW 190, the pride of German design, the Mustang exposed a different weakness. The Focke-Wulf excelled in low-altitude attacks, brutal against ground targets, fierce in tight maneuvers. Yet above 20,000 feet where the bombers flew and the war was decided, it lost its edge. The Mustang seemed to grow stronger the higher it climbed. For the first time in years, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves looking over their shoulders not only for Spitfires, but for an American hunter that had no business being so fast, so agile, and so relentless. Combat reports carried the change in tone. A German officer described a fight near Leipzig in which his formation was bounced from above by Mustangs. He expected them to fall away after a quick pass, as Thunderbolts often did. Instead, they turned sharply and came again and again until his men were scattering, chased all the way down through cloud cover. He admitted bitterly that gravity no longer saves us. Others echoed the sentiment. The old tactic of climbing above the escorts, diving through the bombers, and escaping on speed had been the Luftwaffe's bread and butter. Now it was suicide. The Mustangs stayed glued to their tails, climbing as though the air itself pulled them upward. The psychological shock was immense. German aces were not men easily rattled. Many had scores in the dozens or even hundreds. They had faced every Allied type and found a way to beat it. Yet, here was a machine that took away their certainties. For rookies, the sight of a Mustang silhouette meant panic. For veterans, it meant a grim recognition that the odds were turning. Some admitted privately that if caught alone, their best chance was to dive for home and prey. The war in the air had always been a contest of machines and men, but now it was also a contest of belief. And belief was slipping away. Still, pride endured. In briefings, officers reminded their pilots that skill could overcome technology. They insisted the Reich's machines were still formidable, and in truth, the 109 and 190 could still kill. A Mustang flown carelessly was no invincible angel. But the tide was clear. Losses mounted. Mission after mission, German units returned with fewer men than they had launched. The joke of the Mustang had turned into a tally of comrades shot down. In the ready rooms, laughter faded. In its place came a silence that no one dared to break. By the spring of 1944, the transformation was undeniable. Luftwaffe intelligence, once dismissive, now wrote sober assessments warning that the Mustang matched or exceeded their best fighters in nearly every aspect. The frontline pilots did not need memos to know it. They had seen it in the sky, in the tracer lines that curved relentlessly toward them, in the shadows that refused to be shaken, in the bitter funerals of men who had thought themselves untouchable. The first encounters with the Mustang had begun with arrogance. They ended in awe, tinged with fear. For the Luftwaffe, it was not only a tactical challenge, it was a spiritual wound. Their identity had been forged on the myth of superiority, on the certainty that German engineering and German skill would always outclass the enemy. The Mustang shattered that myth. It revealed that the enemy had caught up, that the hunter could be hunted, that the sky itself no longer belonged to them. And though battles still lay ahead, though many more duels would be fought, the truth was already written in contrails across the high clouds of Europe. The era of German dominance was ending, and the first sign of that end was the slender, once-mocked silhouette of the P-51 Mustang. The underestimation of the Mustang became a legend among those who survived. Pilots would later confess that their first reaction had been laughter, then shock, then respect. Some remembered the bitter irony of telling their comrades not to worry about the new American plane, only to find themselves locked in desperate combat with it weeks later. Others recalled the disbelief of seeing Mustangs circle effortlessly at altitudes where their own machines gasped for air. What united them all was the realization that they had misjudged their opponent, and in war, misjudgment could be fatal. The story of those first encounters is not merely about technology. It is about human certainty and how swiftly it can crumble. German pilots entered 1943 convinced of their superiority. By the close of 1944, many were alive only by luck, pursued across the skies by the very machine they had once dismissed. The Mustang had arrived not with fanfare, but with a whisper, underestimated and ignored. Yet in the crucible of combat it revealed itself as the harbinger of a new order, one in which the Luftwaffe no longer held the keys to the sky. By the end of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a grim stalemate. American bombers rose from English airfields in endless streams, lumbering toward factories, oil plants, and rail yards deep inside the Reich. Their fuselages gleamed in the morning sun, their engines thundered across the channel, and their crews braced themselves for hours of terror. They carried the promise of destruction, but also the certainty of heavy loss. Without escorts that could remain with them to the target and back, the bombers flew into the jaws of the Luftwaffe. B-17s and B-24s bristled with defensive guns, but no number of machine guns could hold off swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs for long. Once the escorts turned back near the Rhine, the German fighters fell on the formations, shredding them with cannon fire, scattering them across the sky. Bombers limped home with holes in their wings, engines trailing smoke, fuselages peppered with dead and wounded. Others never returned. American commanders knew that the strategy of daylight precision bombing was bleeding them white. For the Luftwaffe, this was the battlefield of choice. Their tactic was simple and effective. Wait until the escorts dropped away, mass squadrons in the air corridors, and attack the unprotected bombers in waves. The Reich still had hundreds of experienced aces, men who knew every trick of the sky, and they feasted on the slow, high-flying bombers. The war in the air seemed balanced on a knife's edge, and for Germany, that edge was still sharp. They believed distance was their shield. Then came the P-51 Mustang. What German intelligence had dismissed as a lightweight fighter suddenly appeared in numbers no one could ignore. The secret was not just the Merlin engine that gave it speed and climb, but its wings, fuel tanks, and astonishing reach. With external drop tanks slung under its wings, the Mustang could fly farther than any Escort before it, farther than the Luftwaffe believed possible. From English fields to Berlin and back, from the Channel coast to the factories of Silesia, the Mustang could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and home again. Distance, once the Luftwaffe's greatest ally, evaporated overnight. The change was immediate. On missions in early 1944, German fighters rose as they always had, planning to strike once the escorts peeled away. Instead, they found Mustangs still circling the bombers even as they neared the heart of the Reich. When the Messerschmitts climbed to intercept, they discovered squadrons of P-51s waiting above them, diving down with guns blazing. A Luftwaffe staffel that once expected a harvest of bombers instead found itself scattered, broken before it could reach the target. The shock was not only tactical, but psychological. For years, pilots had counted on the simple truth that the enemy could not follow them deep into their own territory. Now that truth was gone. The escorts developed new tactics to exploit their advantage. They did not merely fly alongside the bombers as guardians. They surged ahead in great sweeps. Clearing the sky before the bomber streams arrived, they patrolled the edges of German airspace, striking at squadrons forming for attack. They roamed over airfields, diving on fighters as they took off or landed. For the Luftwaffe, there was no longer safety in timing or geography. Every stage of the mission was now shadowed by American fighters. Bomber crews felt the change immediately. Before the Mustang, their survival depended on formation, firepower, and luck. After the Mustang, they saw escorts above, below, and around them for hours at a time. Losses that once crippled missions began to fall. Pilots wrote in letters home of the strange relief of looking out their windows over the heart of Germany and still seeing American fighters escorting them. "We were never alone," one recalled. For the first time, daylight bombing became sustainable, not a gamble, but a campaign. For German pilots, the effect was devastating. The old tactic of climbing high and diving through the bombers was suicide when Mustangs hovered above at 30,000 feet. The method of circling and waiting for escorts to run dry no longer worked. The Mustangs had endurance, and more kept coming. Even when a squadron returned home low on fuel, another took its place. The Reich's skies were filling with enemy fighters that refused to leave. The despair shows in captured diaries and reports. One pilot wrote after a mission near Augsburg, "They follow the bombers into our homeland and return with them, as if oceans fill their tanks. There is no distance we can count on now." Another recorded that his unit had scrambled to attack near Leipzig, but was intercepted 10 minutes after takeoff by a wall of Mustangs that came from every side, cutting us to pieces before we reached the fortresses. The statistics confirmed the fear. American losses dropped sharply once long-range escort became routine. German losses mounted. The Luftwaffe was bleeding away the very core of its strength, the experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Every raid now claimed not only factories and oil plants, but dozens of fighters destroyed in combat or bombed on the ground. What had once been a contest became a slaughter. The Mustang's range also meant that German industry could no longer hide behind geography. Synthetic oil plants in central Germany, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, even aircraft assembly lines in Bavaria, all were now within reach of escorted raids. The Luftwaffe could not defend them all. Each week, another vital artery was cut, another resource denied. The fuel that powered fighters became scarce, the replacement aircraft sat idle for lack of parts, and young recruits climbed into cockpits with only hours of training, sent up against veterans of the 8th Air Force protected by Mustangs. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They built new versions of the 109 and 190, heavier armed to rip apart bombers in a single pass. They experimented with rocket attacks, with jet prototypes, with desperate last-ditch measures. But none of it changed the equation. The bombers still came, and the Mustangs still ranged ahead of them, sweeping the skies clean. The rules of the air had been rewritten, and Germany was trapped by them. For the men who had once owned the sky, it was a bitter reversal. Aces who had scored dozens of kills in 1940 and 1941 now found themselves hunted over their own cities. Airfields that had once launched confident squadrons now burned under strafing runs. The laughter that had greeted the first mention of the Mustang was long gone. In its place was silence, broken only by the sound of engines that seemed to grow louder each week, carrying with them the promise of destruction that could not be stopped. The Mustang's gift of range was more than a technical achievement. It was a weapon of inevitability. It stripped the Luftwaffe of its last advantage, denied them the sanctuary of distance, and revealed the war for what it was, a contest of endurance that Germany could not win. With every mission, with every escorted raid, the skies drew tighter around the Reich, and the pilots who once ruled them learned that their time had ended. By 1944, the sky over Europe had changed forever. The Luftwaffe that had once terrified the continent was unraveling, its edges fraying under relentless pressure. The P-51 Mustang had not only broken the shield of distance, it had begun to break the very soul of German air power. The hunters of the Reich, men who had spent years boasting of easy kills and unrivaled machines, now found themselves stalked by an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere, an enemy that did not tire, did not vanish, and did not give them room to breathe. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not sudden, like the detonation of a bomb. It was slow, grinding, inevitable, a process measured in empty hangars, in burned fields, in the faces of young boys sent to die in machines they barely knew how to fly. In the early months of 1944, there were still aces who believed they could turn the tide. Some had over 100 kills recorded, names whispered with reverence in the ready rooms. They had outflown Spitfires, shredded Thunderbolts, and humbled every Allied machine they had faced. For these men, confidence was not arrogance, it was survival. But the Mustang was different. Day after day they climbed into their Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs and returned shaken, their victories fewer, their escapes narrower. Some did not return at all. Diaries of these men speak with a tone rarely seen before, doubt. "The sky is no longer ours," one ace wrote in the spring of 1944. "Everywhere, always, there are Mustangs." The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943, the Luftwaffe could still destroy hundreds of bombers in a single month, at staggering cost to the Allies. By the end of 1944, the balance had shifted completely. The United States could replace bombers and crews with industrial might, but Germany could not replace its pilots. Every German killed was a man with years of experience, irreplaceable in a war where training hours had been slashed to a fraction of what they once were. New recruits, many still teenagers, were rushed into cockpits with as little as 50 hours of flight time, barely enough to master takeoff and landing. They were sent up against veterans of the 8th and 9th Air Forces, men escorted by Mustangs that now ruled the sky like wolves circling sheep. The results were predictable and horrific. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had become a shadow of itself. Entire squadrons were wiped out in a matter of weeks. In one infamous mission over Leipzig, a formation of German fighters tried to intercept the bombers, as they always had. They were met not only by the fortress guns of B-17s, but by swarms of P-51s that cut through them with devastating precision. More than half the German fighters never returned. Survivors who stumbled back to their airfields described the experience with haunted eyes. "We are not hunters anymore," one pilot told his commander. "We are prey." The shift from hunter to hunted was perhaps the most painful transformation for the Luftwaffe. These were men who had built their identities on dominance, who had been celebrated as knights of the air, symbols of German superiority. Now they were forced to scramble into the sky, knowing that they were targets before they even reached the bombers. Mustangs prowled near their bases, waiting to strike as they climbed. Fuel shortages meant that many German fighters could not even afford to climb to combat altitude. They rose with half-empty tanks, fought desperately for minutes, then broke away, hoping to glide home before the Mustangs followed. Often, they never made it. The collapse accelerated after D-Day. Once the Allies had secured footholds in France, new airfields sprouted close to the front, bringing Mustangs even deeper into the Reich. What had once been a battle fought from distant bases in England was now a battle fought from soil captured by Allied troops. German cities that had once been hours from danger were suddenly minutes away. The Luftwaffe's pilots, exhausted and demoralized, found themselves flying against impossible odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. Worse still, they were starved of the resources that kept aircraft in the air. Allied bombers targeted oil facilities relentlessly, and by late 1944, fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. It did not matter how many aircraft rolled out of factories if there was no fuel to train pilots, no fuel to keep squadrons airborne. In some units, pilots were reduced to gliding exercises, practicing landings without ever firing an engine. When these same men were thrown into combat, they were slaughtered. The stories of the aces capture the tragedy of the era. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history, survived, but only by sheer instinct and luck, often flying alone and avoiding combat unless absolutely necessary. Others were not so fortunate. Men who had once laughed at the idea of American fighters superior to theirs were now forced to flee at the sight of a Mustang silhouette. Some died in burning wrecks over their own cities, witnessed by the civilians they had sworn to defend. Others bailed out into fields, watching their parachutes drift down as Mustangs circled above like vultures. The psychological humiliation was almost as heavy as the physical losses. To be hunted over Berlin, Munich, or Vienna was to admit that the Reich no longer owned its own air. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was collapsing in every sense, its structure disintegrated under the weight of losses. Airfields were cratered by bombing and strafing. Factories were destroyed or captured. The once feared Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings of the Reich, were shadows, flying only sporadically, their rosters filled with boys who should have been in school. Veterans who remained fought with grim determination, but even they admitted the truth. The air war was lost. The Mustangs are everywhere, one wrote in February 1945. They are above us, behind us, waiting at our fields. The sky belongs to them. For the Allies, the dominance of the Mustang was more than tactical. It was symbolic. Every contrail of silver fighters stretched across the sky was a reminder that the Reich was shrinking, that its power was eroding not only on the ground but in the very air above its cities. American bombers could now attack targets with relative impunity, knowing that escorts would shield them from start to finish. Bridges, rail yards, and fuel plants burned day after day. German commanders pleaded for relief, but there was none to be found. The war machine was collapsing, and the Mustang was its executioner. The transformation from 1940 to 1945 is staggering. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe dictated the rhythm of combat. They decided when to strike, where to ambush, how to exploit their aircraft's strengths. The Allies were reactive, struggling to catch up, losing men and machines in droves. But by the end, the tables were reversed. The Luftwaffe reacted, scrambling in desperation, while the Allies dictated the terms. The Mustang did not win the war alone, but it was the blade that cut the Luftwaffe's throat. Personal accounts from German pilots highlight the bitter irony. Some confessed that they had once mocked the Mustang as weak, unworthy of respect. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, those same men admitted that it had been the most formidable opponent they had ever faced. One veteran recalled how he and his comrades used to joke that the Americans could build airplanes like they built cars cheap, fast, and disposable. Then we met the Mustang, he said, and we stopped laughing. The collapse of the Luftwaffe in 1944 and 1945 was not merely the failure of machines or tactics. It was the collapse of belief. A force that had once defined itself by its invincibility discovered that it could be broken. Its aces, who had strutted across Europe with victory tallies painted on their rudders, were humbled by defeat. Its rookies, sent to die in hopeless battles, were reminders that the Reich had run out of both time and talent. The Mustang, with its range, its speed, its endurance, and its relentless presence, became the symbol of that collapse. To the Allies, it was a promise of victory. To the Germans, it was a specter of defeat. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was a corpse still twitching. A few jets took to the skies in desperate last stands, but they could not alter the outcome. Allied fighters and bombers roamed freely, pounding what was left of the Reich into rubble. When the surrender came, many German pilots felt relief more than shame. The nightmare of being hunted day after day by Mustangs and bombers was finally over. But the memory lingered. In post-war memoirs, when pilots spoke of the enemy they respected most, it was not the Spitfire or the Thunderbolt. It was the Mustang, always the Mustang. The collapse of the Luftwaffe is one of the great ironies of the Second World War. A force that had once seemed unstoppable was undone not by a single battle, but by a relentless machine that denied it the sky. The hunters had become the hunted, and no amount of pride or propaganda could change that truth. In the end, the Reich's dream of air supremacy died not only in the flames of its cities, but in the contrails of Mustangs slicing across the heavens. The Mustang remains to this day a symbol of freedom and dominance, a machine that carried with it not just firepower, but inevitability. For Germany's pilots, it was the reminder that arrogance can blind even the most skilled. For the world, it was proof that technology, when paired with will, could rewrite the very rules of war. And so the legacy endures. The Mustang is the executioner of the Luftwaffe, the harbinger of the collapse, the machine that turned hunters into prey. If you've listened this far, tell me in the comments, do you think the Mustang was the single most decisive fighter of the war? Or do you believe the Spitfire deserves that crown? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from history that reveal how wars are truly won, not just on the ground, but in the skies above.